Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Present.
Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso.
A quorum is present. Can I read? All post-cloture time has expired. The question occurs on the nomination of Amy Coney Barrett of Indiana to be Associate Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States. A senator. Is there a sufficient second? There is a sufficient second. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Aye. Ms. Baldwin. No. Mr. Barrasso. Aye. Mr. Bennett. Mrs. Blackburn. Aye. Mr. Blumenthal. No. Mr. Blunt. Aye. Mr. Booker. No. Mr. Bozeman. Aye. Mr. Braun. Aye. Mr. Brown. No. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. No. Mrs. Capito. No. Mr. Cardin. No. Mr. Carper. No. Mr. Casey. No. Mr. Cassidy. Aye. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Cornyn. Aye. Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Cotton. Aye. Mr. Kramer. Aye. Mr. Crapo. Aye. Mr. Cruz. Aye. Mr. Daines. Aye. Ms. Duckworth. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Enzi. Aye. Ms. Ernst. Aye. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Fisher. Aye. Mr. Gardner. Aye. Mrs. Gillibrand. No. Mr. Graham. Aye. Mr. Grassley.
Aye.
Ms. Harris. Ms. Hassan. No. Mr. Hawley. Aye. Mr. Heinrich. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Aye. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Johnson. Aye. Mr. Jones. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kennedy. Aye. Mr. King. No. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Langford. Aye. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee. Aye. Mrs. Leffler. Aye. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Markey. No. Mr. McConnell. Ms. McSally. Aye. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Moran. Aye. Ms. Markowski. Aye. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Paul. Aye. Mr. Perdue. Aye. Mr. Peters. No. Mr. Portman. Aye. Mr. Reed. Mr. Risch. Aye. Mr. Roberts. Aye. Mr. Romney. Ms. Rosen. Mr. Rounds. Aye. Mr. Rubio. Aye. Mr. Sanders. No. Mr. Sass. Aye. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Scott of Florida. Aye. Mr. Scott of South Carolina. Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Alexander, Barrasso, Blackburn, Blunt, Bozeman, Braun, Burr, Capito, Cassidy, Cornyn, Cotton, Kramer, Crapo, Cruz, Daines, Enzi, Ernst, Fisher, Gardner, Graham, Grassley, Hawley, Hoven, Heidsmith, Inhofe, Johnson, Kennedy, Lankford, Lee, Loeffler, McConnell, McSally, Moran, Murkowski, Paul, Perdue, Portman, Risch, Roberts, Romney, Rounds, Rubio, Sass, Scott of Florida, Scott of South Carolina, Shelby, Sullivan, Thune, Tillis, Toomey, Wicker, Young. Senators voting in the negative: Baldwin, Blumenthal, Booker, Brown, Cantwell, Cardin, Carper, Casey, Collins, Coons, Cortez Masto, Duckworth, Durbin, Feinstein, Gillibrand, Harris, Hassan, Heinrich, Hirono, Kane, King, Klobuchar, Leahy, Manchin, Markey, Merkley, Murphy, Murray, Peters, Rosen, Sanders, Schumer, Shaheen, Sinema, Smith, Van Hollen, Warner, Warren, Whitehouse, Wyden. Mr. Menendez, no. Mr. Schatz, no. Mr. Reed, no. Ms. Stabenow. Ms. Stabenow, no.
Pennsylvania. Last week, the Supreme Court split 4-4 to leave in place a state Supreme Court decision that extended an absentee ballot return deadline. The Pennsylvania GOP is back in the Supreme Court, asking the court basically to take another look. And if it did take another look and answered differently with a new Justice Barrett on board, that I think would look quite political in a way that could be very damaging to the court. So these recusal questions, I think, will be quite significant. And we don't know from her confirmation hearing answers whether, in fact, she would recuse in such a case.
And top of mind for many is, of course, Obamacare as well as abortion. What do you think the future for Roe v. Wade is with Barrett on the high court and also for Obamacare?
You know, Roe versus Wade, I think, has been a priority of the conservative movement for many, many years, right? Overturning Roe and returning the issue of abortion to the states. And I think with a 6-3 conservative majority on the Supreme Court, I think the chances of Roe being overturned in the near future are very high. What that looks like, quite how long it takes, you know, those are open questions. But I think the chances are very significant that that will happen. Mississippi right now is asking the Supreme Court to review a case involving a ban on abortion after 15 weeks. So the court could take up that case as soon as next week, at least in theory it could. As to health care, the current challenge to Obamacare, you know, most experts think the legal basis of that challenge is quite weak, despite a number of states having brought the challenge and the Trump administration's support for it. So I think that the likely outcome in that case is that the ACA doesn't get thrown out in its entirety, but I think the chances of it happening are much more significant, of it getting thrown out, that is, are much more significant with a Justice Barrett than, of course, with a Justice Ginsburg. And I think the context here is that, you know, it is possible that there will be other challenges to Obamacare and that a court with Amy Coney Barrett on it will be receptive to those challenges. Of course, this is just the latest of a long line of challenges to the Affordable Care Act since its passage. So yes, I think it is in a much more vulnerable position following the likely confirmation this evening than it was before.
Thank you, Kate. I'd like to bring back in Terry Moran. And Terry, earlier tonight we talked to Senator Manchin of West Virginia, and he was talking about what I think that a lot of the Democratic senators feel, which is that he was voting no on Amy Coney Barrett out of principle, not because of her qualifications. Give us a sense of Amy Coney Barrett, the judge, and her qualifications and her belief system.
Yeah, that's a great question, because judges obviously aren't robots. Justices bring their life experiences and their values, and she will too. She's 48 years old, on the younger side for a Supreme Court justice. She'll be there for a long time in all likelihood. And as Senator Lindsey Graham said at the Judiciary Committee hearing, she is the first proudly pro-life, anti-abortion rights woman on the Supreme Court. She's a proud person who is a devout Catholic, has belonged to a charismatic Catholic group for years, and she'll bring all that. On the other, she's also a mother of 7 children, including 2 adopted from Haiti. She spoke movingly during those hearings of speaking to her older daughter from Haiti, a black teenager, about the killing of George Floyd and how they shed tears together about that. She brings that to the court. What she doesn't bring to the court is wide experience. She's never represented the defendant. She's never prosecuted anyone. She's never handled a trial. She's never done an appellate case. She has lived her life really in the confines of academia and then appellate law. So she has somewhat narrow experience that way. That said, that she's going to bring a fine legal mind, no question about it, and a very conservative bent to this Supreme Court. She not only cements the Supreme Court majority, she's going to shift this court to the right.
And Terry, we can hear a lot of protesters that seem to have gathered outside there now. I'd like to bring back in Devin. And Devin, of course, her confirmation means a major shift in the balance of power on the court. We're talking about the 6-3 conservative majority on the court. Tell us about the implications of that.
Yeah, Terry was just driving home that point. And, it's more than just the number of votes on the bench, 6 conservatives, 3 liberals. But
come hold your thought 1 second. We're going to go to the vote right now.
Of Indiana to be an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States is confirmed.
And there you have it, the confirmation of Judge Amy Coney Barrett, that announcement made with the mask on. And Devin, I'm sorry we interrupted you to hear that vote and that confirmation, but continue. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, it's extraordinary to see this play out. Charles Grassley, the senator of Iowa, who chaired the Judiciary Committee for so many years, sat in charge of so many Supreme Court justice confirmations, calling that vote. Lindsay, as we were saying earlier, 52-48, one of the narrowest margins in history, another sign of how polarized this is. But to pick up on that last point, this Supreme Court now tonight is not only a 6-3 conservative majority, but it means Chief Justice John Roberts, who we've all been fixated on for so long as that moderate swing vote, someone who prizes the institution of the Supreme Court and how it's perceived, especially in a political season. He is now having a lot less power in single-handedly being able to shift the court. So tonight, he's probably watching this just on the heels of a pretty contentious election season, wondering how that new majority is going to deal with him.
And Devin, you know, she's going to get right to work. I mean, there was a major Supreme Court vote earlier today, Obamacare, right after the election.
Yeah, I mean, the wave of election cases coming before the court was happening just minutes up to this vote. In fact, the Supreme Court tonight, in a 5-3 decision, refused to extend the absentee ballot deadline in Wisconsin by 6 days, something that a lower court judge had ordered because of the pandemic. So this court is very much involved in this contentious election right now. And Amy Coney Barrett, as soon as she takes 2 oaths in the next 24 hours, will be part of those conversations and part of those votes. A lot ahead. Affordable Care Act, as you said, abortion you talked with Kate about, but environmental issues, religious liberty issues, so many other bankruptcy cases, corporate finance. There's a lot before the Supreme Court that will touch all of our lives in these months ahead.
And I'd like to bring back in Kate Shaw. Kate, I'd like to give you a final thought here as we witness history and the implications that will remain for generations.
You know, I think we may now have the most conservative Supreme Court in maybe 100 years. And I think that really will, as Terry was saying, the Supreme Court has been relatively liberal. It was in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, has been under William Rehnquist and now John Roberts, a much more conservative institution, but always with a couple of moderating sort of centrists on the court in recent decades. We don't really have that anymore. John Roberts is the closest, but he's quite conservative. So there are either 5 or 6, depending on how you look at it, strongly conservative justices on this Supreme Court. And if the Democrats aren't in a position to actually implement or at least consider structural reform and potential court expansion, we may see really dramatic changes to the kind of body of American law, constitutional and statutory, in the coming months and years. So this is a hugely significant development for the Supreme Court and for everyone.
Kate Shaw, we thank you so much. There you have it. President Trump and Senate Republicans have succeeded in getting Judge Amy Coney Barrett confirmed to the Supreme Court. The confirmation vote you've been watching was closer to Election Day than any other vote on a Supreme Court justice in American history. The final vote there, 52-48. We will, of course, continue to report on this historic vote and bring you the first swearing-in ceremony for Amy Coney Barrett. This event planned on the White House South Lawn later on this evening. For those of you watching us on ABC News Live from our stations, thanks so much for watching.